Hi, Jake. The Bewen Neolakakoke. Hi, all. It's good to see you all today. Viva Miamia. So I'm Miami, specifically a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. My ancestors come from our ancestral homelands, Ohio and Indiana, and that's roughly where I grew up. Right away, we see there a situation of shift that's caused by colonization. In this case, where my tribe is politically centered in Oklahoma, but originally comes from Indiana and Ohio. It's just one of the many ways in which colonization, imperialism, various other related issues by the United States have affected Native American communities. What happened with my own tribe is that I understand that back in the 19th century, people still spoke Nyamyatawenge, Miami, also the name of our language, as a first language. I heard somewhere that as of 1910, there were 4 monolingual Miami speakers recorded in some census. But when I was growing up, and I'm not that old, I'm 40, so when I was growing up in the 1980s, I didn't hear a tribal language. When I was at tribal functions, everything was in English. The exception is that some people have had in Miami names, and certainly some awareness of our language, but it wasn't in active use. My grandfather, the late Chief Floyd Leonard, was the chief of our tribe, and he knew a little bit. This situation is common and it is problematic. It comes from trauma. My work is about addressing that trauma, the underlying causes of language shift, which are social. They're not grammatical. They have nothing to do with the language as a grammatical unit. They have everything to do with situations of people. So a lot of my work then is in reclaiming languages, restoring languages to their appropriate use, and dealing with the related attitudes in communities. And this is very much a social phenomenon. So what happened then is that when I was getting into linguistics, which I discovered in an introductory course, much like yours, I started looking up a tribal language, and I knew of language reclamation efforts that were beginning in my community around this time. And one of the things that kept happening was that in these important sort of scientific classifications, sorts of official-looking documents, my tribe language was called extinct. Now we call that the E word. Of course we can say extinct. It's not that we can't say it. It's not that I don't recognize that certain things in the world are irretrievably lost. Miamia language is not one of them. For that matter, many, many indigenous languages that are called extinct are not. They exist in documentation. They are claimed by living peoples, contemporary indigenous peoples, who can learn those languages from that documentation, bring them back into everyday use, or use them however they deem appropriate, and start addressing that colonial trauma. Over the years, we Miamis have been challenging that E word, instead claiming that our language was sleeping for the period of time, roughly 30 years, in which nobody knew it fluently. And now, of course, it's a awakened language, so maybe, if you will, a formerly sleeping language. But nevertheless, in linguistic science, in broader society, sometimes any time a Native American language has undergone a complete break in transmission, even when it started again, broader social attitudes will deem that language to belong in the past. We'll say that people who used to live here, the language that used to be spoken here, and so on, when in fact we're very much around today, and our languages are important. I'm proud of my community, so doing what other people have deemed impossible, but in fact it really isn't. Languages, if they exist in documentation, if people want to learn them, they can do so, and they have many, many, many times. Sometimes my own students, so I'm a professor of ethnic studies, but I've taught, my PhD is in linguistics, and I've taught linguistics over many, many years. Sometimes my own students have posed questions to the effect of, gee, language reclamation must be so hard. So they have this, well, they don't call it an extinct language, at least not in front of me. we have this language that people don't actively know, and everybody in the community already speaks English, and that, by the way, is true for Miamis. As far as I know, we all speak English as a first language. So why are people working so hard to bring their languages back? And I like to turn that question around and say, well, here's what's going on. People are working very, very hard to reclaim their languages. What does that tell you about the importance of language to those communities? I think it's very, very important for everybody, but especially for people in linguistics, to actively interrogate, to actively ask what language is, and to ask all sorts of people. In linguistic science, language is often defined in terms of structural units, sounds and words and clauses and so on, or it's thought about as a cognitive mechanism. And indeed, of course, there's a lot of cognition underlying language and interesting things to be discovered and understood in relation to that. But in an interview that I did with a fellow Miami person, Miami language was defined as, not just described, but defined as a way that our community connects to each other, how we know each other. Many, many other Native American people I've spoken to from a wide variety of languages will say things to the effect of, language is power. Language is us. Language is the wisdom that comes from our ancestors and that also moves us forward, because keep in mind, we're not locked in the past, we're looking toward the future, and our language belongs in that. So with all of those things said, it's not at all surprising to me that people care about their languages because they need them. Language reclamation is a type of healing. It's a way of dealing with colonial trauma that's still imposed, but it's not in any way inherent. And Native peoples are around, Native languages, that's capital N Native, meaning Native American or Indigenous. Native languages are around. At least 300 or so in the present day United States and Canada. But counting individual languages, or saying how many speakers are this, how many languages are there, how many are extinct, I wouldn't say that. All of those things are particularly problematic because they're considering languages as objects, sort of objects of study, objects that can be named, objects that can be sort of cleanly demarcated in ways that don't really pan out among actual people. I hope that my message is coming through here, which is that language reclamation is important because language is important. But let me share another insight that I've developed over the years, which is that language reclamation must be grounded in community needs and values, including values about language, definitions of language. If a person defines language as themselves, such that their sense of personal identity or community identity and linguistic identity are kind of the same thing, the implications of working with language, of teaching language, of analyzing language, of describing language, of language shift, whether it be away from a language or back toward a language, the implications of all of those things are likewise going to be very, very, very high. It becomes very, very, very important. We're at a situation right now where Indigenous communities are, in fact, reclaiming their languages, focusing the question on vitality and on the future, not on the past, or not on sort of resurrecting the past or something like that. Language reclamation, again, is healing. It is a political statement. It is a social movement, and it's here to stay. I found that linguistic science, particularly its tools for reconstructing languages or for understanding, discerning patterns and then being able to apply those for people who are learning language, I found that to be tremendously helpful, particularly for my own tribal language, which had to be brought back into use from archival documentation. It takes quite a bit of linguistic science to figure out those patterns. But that said, language shift, when a community moves away from a given language or back toward a given language, is not about language in a narrowly defined sense. It's not about grammar. It's not about research on the language. It takes all of those things. Those are all important, but that's not what's really going on. Communities move away from a given language because of socio-political economic, and similar pressures. Native Americans who don't actively speak in native languages are in that situation because of colonization and because of settler colonialism. That is to say, colonization in the United States and many other places has never ended. There are people who sort of have settled into the lands and sort of redefined it as their own, in many ways erasing the native populations or relegating them to the past with terms like extinct or people who used to live here as opposed to the people of this land who still live here and have special responsibility to the place. Many of the language situations that we see today here in the United States and in many other places are very significantly affected by policies of colonizing governments, such as that of the United States. It's in the 1870s that the United States started a policy of federal boarding schools where Native Americans, American Indian children from multiple tribes were brought into educational institutions, boarding schools, so not sort of in their homelands, but rather a place where people of multiple nations would be brought together to be civilized, to be socialized into Euro-American norms at the expense of long intellectual traditions, cultural norms, and languages that they already had. In fact, many of these students were not allowed to speak their Native American languages and were punished for doing so. Within my own family, it's about 4 generations back now, where there are accounts of saying, well, they used to wash our mouths out with soap, or beat us, or otherwise prevent people from speaking their languages. These are policies about sort of erasing indigenous cultures and indigenous peoples. And these policies, or rather the effects of those policies, live on from one generation to the next. We can think about this as intergenerational trauma, and it's something I see a lot in my own work among various Native American communities. It's not the situation that when a language goes out of use, bim, bam, boom, it's done, but rather that the trauma under which that occurred gets transmitted from one generation to the next, and so on, until something intervenes, until people make things right and reclaim their own values, their connection to land and to each other, their spirituality, all of the above, and especially their languages. Language reclamation, because it's really responding to these things, has to take all of those things into account. And that's why, even though my own immediate academic training is in linguistics, I'm relatively broad in my work, and I bring in multiple fields. Native American studies, where I'm currently located, but also sort of anthropology, sociology, history, economics. We can go down the list. Because languages don't exist and are not transmitted or not, or used in socio-political vacuums. Rather, language use or non-use always occurs in a socio-political context. And I think it's incredibly important that we always keep that in mind, because otherwise, we're just left with grammar, which is kind of interesting, I admit. Studied it for many, many years. But in context of Native American language reclamation, that's a tool. That's a tool that needs to sort of be applied to something else, which is much, much, much larger.